Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC here on YouTube. I'm Valerie Sanderson and I'm joined by our Middle East analyst Sebastian Usher. Now, Israel has just passed a law to impose the death penalty on those involved with the Hamas attacks back on October the 7th, 2023. Tell us more about it.
Yes, this was passed in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, 96-0 of those who attended across both the coalition government and the opposition. So it got full support. And there will be, if this takes place, there'll be trials which could be live streamed of those who've been detained, both for carrying out killings on October the 7th, but also if they took hostages, they're liable to face the death penalty. They could be charged on a number of crimes. The one which would, I think, see them executed, if this does go ahead, would be on the crime of genocide. So this is something that I think it's one of a few things that has kind of brought MPs in the Israeli parliament together on this issue. For many, they see the Hamas militants who were involved on October the 7th as modern-day Nazis. That's the kind of language that's been used. And I think it's important to say that in the history of Israel, there have only been two people who've been executed. One of them was Adolf Eichmann, who was seen as one of the main drivers of the Holocaust. Very, very famous trial, of course, which was televised back in the 1960s. Never since then. And that was presented at the time as a unique moment, a unique crime that needed to be dealt with in a unique way. I think some of the emotion that still hangs around October the 7th is what is motoring this and putting it on that scale.
So it is a change.
It would be a big change, yes. As I say, I mean, if you've only carried out two executions throughout the history of the state, a massive change. Now, it's not without its critics from two sides, really. One from human rights groups, as you'd imagine, who say that many of those who've been held have been held in very difficult conditions. There is the possibility that what they might have said could have been through coercion that might be used against them. Also, that the trials might not give them the opportunity to defend themselves, or if there's an appeal, to go to through a process that will give them their full rights. There's that element to it. Also, the element that perhaps it might become a show trial if it's live streamed, if it's shown on TV, and the other people who have sort of not been against it especially, but not particularly engaged, are quite a lot of the families of those who were killed and of hostages, because what they're most interested in, what they've been campaigning for, I mean, originally it was about getting the release of all the hostages that remained in Gaza. That's happened, alive or dead. The other is about justice within Israel over what happened, and that those in the army, in politics, who they feel had some responsibility for the failures, for security failures that day, that they should be held to account.
They want an independent inquiry, don't they?
They want an independent inquiry. And in fact, some of those families held, before this vote was taken, they held a meeting in the environs of the Knesset to make that demand. And for them, this is kind of almost a side issue.
We should say that there was another law approved, wasn't there, just a few weeks ago for Palestinians accused of terrorism crimes. Exactly.
That's a completely different law, though. This is quite separate from that. I think there is a distinction, and I think that as far as October the 7th is concerned, as I said, this brought MPs together. I think that crime is seen as such an abhorrence, such a stain on Israel and on humanity, that the worst possible punishment is kind of generally accepted and maybe supported within Israel. The other death penalty is not about October the 7th. It's generally about Palestinians in the occupied West Bank who have been charged, who've been found guilty of carrying out attacks that resulted in the deaths of Israelis or others. And that was a law that was very much pushed through by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the very far-right national security minister. He actually, when it was passed a few weeks ago, I was in Israel at the time, I remember this well, he had opened up bottles of champagne to celebrate, and the people supporting it had little nooses that they were carrying on their jackets. That has not been as popular, I would say, within Israel, and definitely it has been massively condemned, not just by human rights activists, by the Palestinians themselves, because it's a law that is seen as discrimination. Because essentially, even though it doesn't specify 100% that it would only apply to Palestinians, in practice, it's generally accepted that it would only be Palestinians who carry out terror attacks that result in deaths that would face this, and they would be hanged. Israelis, Jewish settlers, for example, who are involved in similar incidents against Palestinians, because it's not an attack on the state of Israel, which is in that law, would not be held to account in that way.
So are we looking at the possibility of mass executions of Palestinians?
We are. That first law could be struck down by the Supreme Court. In fact, it's considered relatively likely that the Supreme Court will strike it down. And like I say, it doesn't carry the full weight of support within the Knesset. So we'll have to wait and see on that. And I think that would be a massive new step for Israel to take, one that would have very, very big consequences for Israel in the way that it's regarded in the rest of the world.
You've spent a lot of time in Israel recently over the past couple of years. What does this tell you, do you think, about Israeli society, the way it's going and the way it's changed?
It tells us that since October the 7th, but leading up to that as well, but how Israeli society, well, one, politically, it's been dominated by quite hard right figures. They've been able to push the agenda, I would say. That may change. There's elections that are due later this year.
And of course, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu.
The government of Benjamin Netanyahu, yeah. In order to finally get a coalition together that could survive more than a couple of months, he had to bring in these far-right parties, people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, as I said, who made it his absolute, aim to bring in this law about the death penalty for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Israelis themselves, as I say, as far as October the 7th is concerned, there is, as you would understand, a general consensus that this was the worst crime against not just Israelis, but Jewish people since the Holocaust, and that therefore it needs to be treated in that way. So there aren't many people speaking out in terms of any kind of defense of anyone who was involved on that day in attacks on Israelis. As I say, there are human rights groups who don't want the death penalty to be introduced into Israel. There are many Israelis who would feel the same way, who would feel that it's not the way that a state like Israel that sees itself as very modern it's always sold itself as the one true democracy within the Middle East. And this is something that those people would feel is veering away from that ideal. But attitudes have hardened, as you can imagine. They've hardened amongst the Israelis, they've hardened amongst the Palestinians, they've hardened amongst the Arab people, they've hardened across the world. We've all seen it. You see it here in the UK. This is an issue that has split people in so many ways. And so you're not having any really, truly engaged political debate over these issues.
Sebastian Usher, thank you. That was our Middle East analyst, Sebastian Usher. If you want more on this story, just listen to our Global News podcast. Click on the link below. But that's it from this edition. Thanks for listening and thanks for watching, and bye for now.